Hi, and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video, I'm going to be building the 1/48 scale Kawasaki KI-61 1D Hien from Tamiya, as voted for by my patrons. Before we get stuck in, let's take a quick look inside the box. The instructions are the usual Tamiya affair. They're straightforward and easy to follow. The only downside is that the instructions come in a fold-out format instead of a booklet. This makes handling it on the workbench slightly tricky. Alongside the instructions, you get a large, double-sided painting profile. Unfortunately, this is in black and white, but you get the idea. So let's take a look at the plastic parts. A bonus item you get in this kit is one half of the fuselage moulded in clear styrene. Now it's not crystal clear, so in my opinion it's a bit useless. The rest of the parts come moulded in the standard grey Tamiya styrene, and as you'd expect, the detail is pretty nice. As I got this kit before I started making videos, some parts have already been removed and dry fitted, but luckily I've learnt a bit of patience since then. But anyway, I couldn't find any flash on my sprues, and any ejector pin marks were either really small or positioned so you won't see them. The kit also comes with a basic engine, which is a nice feature. The clear parts are crystal clear and the canopy framings are sharp. Masking this is going to be fairly easy, especially with the addition of these masks. Now they're not pre-cut, so you've got to cut them out, but that should be fairly simple. You also get 2 poly caps. The decals look nicely printed, but in this video I'm going to try and use as few of them as possible. I'm going to be using a few aftermarket goodies for this build, so let's quickly go through them. First up are some Brassin weighted resin wheels from Eduard, some Quick Boost gear bay doors, some Quick Boost machine guns, some Eduard photo etch seat belts, a set of Montex vinyl masks, some replacement Quick Boost exhausts, some HGW wet transfers for the stencils, and a Dead Design Studios mask set for panels and access hatches. A friend also cut me some spare masks for the tail flashes. And that's it. Let's get on with the build. Like most aircraft kits, the build started in the cockpit. Parts were removed from the sprues with my God Hand sprue cutters and glued in place with VMS fast setting styrene cement. I hadn't got far into the build until I had to break out the airbrush. All the interior parts were given a base layer of Mr. Colour GX2 thinned with Mr. Leveling thinners. When this had dried, everything was given a layer of ALCLAD aluminium. This was sprayed at 12 psi. The ALCLAD was built up in thin, wet coats. If the ALCLAD goes down too dry, it doesn't look quite as good. The cockpit parts were then given 2 light coats of MIG chipping fluid. This was then covered with a layer of AK Real Colour DUNKELGELB thinned with Mr. Leveling thinner. Using warm water, some of the real colour was scrubbed away with an interdental brush, a toothpick and an old brush to reveal some aluminium chipping. I don't think I used enough chipping fluid as it was quite hard to remove the paint. I fall into the same trap with every build. I use too little chipping fluid. Next time I'm just going to dip the part. Just kidding, I'm not actually going to do that. The small details in the cockpit were picked out with my Artist's Opus 20 Kalinsky Sable and various Vallejo colours. The padded part of the seat was painted with Vallejo Field Drab. This was highlighted by adding stencil and darkened by adding German Sea Black Brown. Even though I wasn't going to have the engine on display, I still painted it with a mix of MRP, burnt iron and black. Next up were the cockpit decals. VMS Decal Set and Fix was applied to help the decals adhere to the surface. After soaking them in warm water, the decals were then applied to the instrument panel. There are more decals in this section alone than over the entirety of the finished build. Once the decals had dried, they were given a layer of VMS decal softener to help them settle into the details. This was then sealed in with a layer of matte varnish, and the dial glass was picked out with ALCLAD AQUAGLOSS. The Eduard photo etch seatbelts were bent into shape and glued onto the seat with VMS FLEXY 5K CA. I think the Eduard seatbelts look okay. While they're not the best, I mean they're not quite the quality of a fabric seatbelt, they're definitely better than using the decal supplied in the kit. Next up, the whole cockpit was given a wash with my new favourite colour, ABTEILUNG 502 Sepia. As the cockpit was pretty much complete, it was time to start bringing these small sub-assemblies together. The fuselage halves are glued together before you insert the cockpit. These were glued together with fast setting cement. The fit was really good, but there are some minor seams that I'll deal with later. The cockpit assembly fitted in quite nicely, when Sausage Fingers here figured out how to do it. It's now time to start assembling the wings. This was fairly straightforward and the fit was good. Next up, I popped the wing assembly onto the fuselage. This fit really nicely and was really well engineered. The spinner and propeller assembly had a polycap mounted inside. This will make it a lot easier to paint the propeller, as I can just pop it off when I want to. The wing-mounted weaponry was glued in place to the inside of the wing fillets with VMS slow setting superglue. This gave me enough working time to make sure they were lined up correctly. While the Montex set came with vinyl canopy masks, I decided to go with the Tamiya ones. I find the kabuki tape conforms and sticks better to curved surfaces. These were cut very carefully with a fresh scalpel blade. The canopy masks were then carefully put into place. The kit transparencies were then glued in place with VMS TRANSPA Fix 6K. This has a fairly long setting time, making positioning that little bit easier. With most of the construction complete, I can move on to painting. The canopy framing was first given a base coat of AK Real Colour DUNKELGELB. This was to simulate the interior framework colour. To prepare the surface for paint and to highlight any flaws, the whole model was given a layer of MRP black primer. When the primer had dried, I noticed some small seam lines on the underside of the fuselage. These were filled by dabbing on some superglue, and whilst the superglue was still wet, sanding the surface. This is a great method for dealing with small seams, as the superglue dries so quickly and is hard almost immediately. To prepare the surface for the metallic ALCLAD paints, I gave the entire model a coat of Mr. Colour GX2 thinned with Mr. Leveling thinner. When this first layer had dried, I inspected the finish for any dust or texture and buffed it out with 3600 MICROMESH polishing cloth. The model was then given another layer of Mr. Colour GX2. Before this had dried, I sprayed over a liberal coat of pure Mr. Leveling thinner. This will help smooth out the finish. I added some grey mottles with a splatter stencil to try and add some visual texture to the finish. Although this didn't actually work and was a waste of time, I decided to leave the footage in anyway. I think the Dead Design mask set is really useful for a bare metal finish aircraft. The idea is to paint small panels, different colours to the main finish and then mask them off. I used ALCLAD dark and white aluminium to pick out some of the access hatches. I used the Dead Design instructions as a guide as to which ones to paint. The vinyl masks were carefully removed from their backing paper with a sharp knife. These were then pressed into place. I dealt with any overspray with Mr. Colour GX2. The whole airframe was then given 2 layers of ALCLAD aluminium. To add some more variation to the metallic finish, I masked off some panels and sprayed them with ALCLAD white aluminium. All of the tape and the dead design masks were then removed, very carefully, with a sharp knife and some tweezers. The contrast on the panels was toned down with a light layer of ALCLAD aluminium. As the white aluminium was so bright, this toned it down quite nicely. The panel around the exhaust was masked off and then sprayed with MRP black. The anti-glare panel on Japanese aircraft was usually slightly worn. I sprayed some Tamiya black mixed with just a touch of MRP True Blue over some MIG chipping fluid. This was then chipped away with warm water, an interdental brush and a soft brush. On this build, I'm trying to avoid decals and the numerous clear coats that can go with them, so I'm using paint masks for as many of the markings as I can. This started with the Hinamarus. The Montex masks were carefully positioned using the decal guide as a guide. I then sprayed a layer of MRP white, which is very smooth and high covering. The roundels were then lightly pre-shaded with a mix of primer red and white. For the main colour of the Hinamarus, I used Mr. Colour Red, IJN aircraft marking, and built this up in light layers. In the initial stages, this looks like a magenta or hot pink, but as you add more layers, the red becomes more deep and much more vibrant. When using paint masks, it's essential to use very thin layers. If you're not careful, you can end up with a really noticeable step. That's why it's best to keep the layers thin. Once I was happy with the opacity, the masks were carefully removed. Next up on my masking agenda was the blue ID band along the side of the fuselage. For a sharper edge, this was masked mostly with Tamiya masking tape for curves. This was painted with MRP True Blue straight out of the bottle. Again, being careful to build it up in light layers. The white flash on the vertical stabilizer and rudder was probably the one thing I was looking forward to the least. Luckily, the complex mask went down fairly well and there was minimal touch-ups required. Because of the delicate mask and the irregular surface, I tried my best to spray this at 90 degrees. Removing these masks was a tense moment. But luckily, most of it was okay. Any light areas of red overspray were brush painted with Vallejo cold white. No masks were supplied for these Japanese characters, and my brush painted attempts left a lot to be desired, so I went with the kit decals. Luckily, they were being applied to a painted and not a metallic surface, so it didn't matter too much. The red warning lines around the flaps and MG access panels were meticulously masked. These were then sprayed with Japanese aircraft marking red. Another MRP colour, Insignia Yellow, was used to spray the ID bands on the front of the wings. Before I applied any camo, I had to apply the HGW wet transfers. When you finish with these, there's absolutely no carrier film, which makes them great for a natural metal finish aircraft. I've heard horror stories of these going wrong, so I followed the instructions to a T. I used warm water, missed a mark setter, and left them for 6 to 8 hours before peeling off the backing film. I had to be really careful not to scratch the metal finish when removing the backing film. Now it's time to ruin all my hard work with some camouflage. I used AK Real Colour Olive Green RAL 6003 thinned with Mr. Leveling thinners and my 0.2 airbrush. This was sprayed carefully at around 12 psi. I tried to stay as close to the surface as I could to avoid any unnecessary overspray. I made sure to clean my airbrush thoroughly before attempting this, as I didn't want any disasters, and I think it came out okay. I've done this scheme once before in 1/72nd, and it was a lot easier in 1/48th. The next job was to paint up some of the small details. I started with the exhaust pipes. These were primed with GX2 and then painted with ALCLAD pale burnt metal. The tips of the exhaust pipes were picked out with ALCLAD jet exhaust. After a few minutes, this was given a wash with LIFECOLOUR liquid pigments burned blue exhaust. The exhaust pipes were then mounted to the model with VMX FLEXY 5K superglue. The nose MGs were also added around this time. The quick boost gear bay doors were quite nice. They were slightly thinner than the original Tamiya piece, and they also had some rivet detail. These were painted up in the same way as the rest of the airframe. The Edward wheels were more detailed than the kit parts and had a nice subtle bulge to them. These were primed with MRP black primer and then sprayed with a dark grey. The hubs were then masked and painted with ALCLAD dark aluminium. I added some dirt splatters to the paint finish with an ultra thin mix of MRP black and red brown. I wanted to keep the weathering light on this model so as not to detract from the complex paint scheme. I applied a wash of ABTEILUNG 502 Sepia mixed with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier. Once the thinner had evaporated, I wiped off the excess with a cotton bud. Once the wash had dried, it was time for one of the most satisfying parts of any aircraft build: removing the canopy masks. After searching and searching for references, I found that the drop tanks were sometimes green. These were sprayed in an olive colour and then speckled with various oil colours. The speckling was also carried over to the underside of the aircraft to add some more tonal variation. The propeller was painted with Mr. Colour Japanese propeller brown and then pushed into place. The final step was to add some rigging with INFINI model 1/32 AERO rigging wire, and the build was complete. I want to give a big thanks to my patrons. You guys are awesome and you help keep the channel running. If you're interested in becoming a patron, head over to patreon.com/LPJmodels or click the card in the corner. Don't forget to leave a comment letting me know how I did in the comment section below. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Finally, I want to thank you for watching. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.